Review of 1984. By Isaac Asimov. I've been writing a 4-part article for Field Newspaper Syndicate at the beginning of each year for several years now, and in 1980, mindful of the approach of the year 1984, FNS asked me to write a thorough critique of George Orwell's novel 1984. I was reluctant. I remembered almost nothing of the book and said so, but Denison DeMack, the lovely young woman who was my contact at FNS, simply sent me a copy of it and said, "Read it." So I read it and found myself absolutely astonished at what I read. I wondered how many people who talked about the novel so glibly had ever read it, or if they had, whether they remembered it at all. I felt I would have to write the critique if only to set people straight. I'm sorry, I love setting people straight. The writing of 1984. In 1949, a book entitled 1984 was published. It was written by Eric Arthur Blair under the pseudonym of George Orwell. The book attempted to show what life would be like in a world of total evil, in which those controlling the government kept themselves in power by brute force, by distorting the truth, by continually rewriting history, by mesmerizing the people generally. This evil world was placed only 35 years in the future so that even men who were already in their early middle age at the time the book was published might live to see it if they lived out a normal lifetime. I, for instance, was already a married man when the book appeared, and yet here we are less than 4 years away from that apocalyptic year, for 1984 feet has become a year that is associated with dread because of Orwell's book, and I am very likely to live to see it. In this chapter, I will discuss the book, but first, who was Blair Orwell and why was the book written? Blair was born in 1903 into the status of a British gentleman. His father was in the Indian Civil Service and Blair himself lived the life of a British imperial official. He went to Eton, served in Burma, and so on. However, he lacked the money to be an English gentleman to the full. Then, too, he didn't want to spend his time at dull desk jobs, he wanted to be a writer. Thirdly, he felt guilty about his status in the upper class. So he did in the late 1920s what so many well-to-do American young people in the 1960s did. In short, he became what we would have called a hippie, at a later time. He lived under slum conditions in London and Paris, consorted with and identified with slum dwellers and vagrants, managed to ease his conscience and, at the same time, to gather material for his earliest books. He also turned left-wing and became a socialist, fighting with the Loyalists in Spain in the 1930s. There he found himself caught up in the sectarian struggles between the various left-wing factions, and since he believed in a gentlemanly English form of socialism, he was inevitably on the losing side. Opposed to him were passionate Spanish anarchists, syndicalists, and communists, who bitterly resented the fact that the necessities of fighting the Franco-fascists got in the way of their fighting each other. The communists, who were the best organized, won out and Orwell had to leave Spain, for he was convinced that if he did not, he would be killed. From then on, to the end of his life, he carried on a private literary war with the communists, determined to win in words the battle he had lost in action. During World War II, in which he was rejected for military service, he was associated with the left wing of the British Labour Party, but didn't much sympathize with their views, for even their reckless version of socialism seemed too well organized for him. He wasn't much affected, apparently, by the Nazi brand of totalitarianism, for there was no room within him except for his private war with Stalinist communism. Consequently, when Great Britain was fighting for its life against Nazism, and the Soviet Union fought as an ally in the struggle and contributed rather more than its share in lives lost and in resolute courage, Orwell wrote Animal Farm, which was a satire of the Russian Revolution and what followed, picturing it in terms of a revolt of barnyard animals against human masters. He completed Animal Farm in 1944 and had trouble finding a publisher since it wasn't a particularly good time for upsetting the Soviets. As soon as the war came to an end, however, the Soviet Union was fair game and Animal Farm was published. It was greeted with much acclaim and Orwell became sufficiently prosperous to retire and devote himself to his masterpiece, 1984. That book described society as a vast worldwide extension of Stalinist Russia in the 1930s, pictured with the venom of a rival left-wing sectarian. Other forms of totalitarianism play a small role. There are 1 or 2 mentions of the Nazis and of the Inquisition. At the very start, there is a reference or two to Jews, almost as though they were going to prove the objects of persecution, but that vanishes almost at once, as though Orwell didn't want readers to mistake the villains for Nazis. The picture is of Stalinism, and Stalinism only. By the time the book came out in 1949, the Cold War was at its height. The book therefore proved popular. It was almost a matter of patriotism in the West to buy it and talk about it, and perhaps even to read parts of it, although it is my opinion that more people bought it and talked about it than read it, for it is a dreadfully dull book, didactic, repetitious, and all but motionless. It was most popular at first with people who leaned towards the conservative side of the political spectrum, for it was clearly an anti-Soviet polemic, and the picture of life it projected in the London of 1984 was very much as conservatives imagined life in the Moscow of 1949 to be. During the McCarthy era in the United States, 1984 became increasingly popular with those who leaned towards the liberal side of the political spectrum, for it seemed to them that the United States of the early 1950s was beginning to move in the direction of thought control and that all the viciousness Orwell had depicted was on its way towards us. Thus, in an afterword to an edition published in paperback by New American Library in 1961, the liberal psychoanalyst and philosopher Erich Fromm concluded as follows. Books like Orwell's are powerful warnings, and it would be most unfortunate if the reader smugly interpreted 1984 as another description of Stalinist barbarism, and if he does not see that it means us, too. Even if Stalinism and McCarthyism are disregarded, however, more and more Americans were becoming aware of just how big the government was getting, how high taxes were, how increasingly rules and regulations permeated business and even ordinary life, how information concerning every facet of private life was entering the files not only of government bureau but of private credit systems. 1984, therefore, came to stand not for Stalinism, or even for dictatorship in general but merely for government. Even governmental paternalism seemed 1984-ish, and the catchphrase "Big Brother is watching you" came to mean everything that was too big for the individual to control. It was not only big government and big business that was a symptom of 1984 but big science, big labor, big anything. In fact, so thoroughly has 1984 penetrated the consciousness of many who have not read the book and have no notion of what it contains, that one wonders what will happen to us after the 31st of December 1984. When New Year's Day of 1985 arrives and the United States is still in existence and facing very much the problems it faces today, how will we express our fears of whatever aspect of life fills us with apprehension? What new date can we invent to take the place of 1984? Orwell did not live to see his book become the success it did. He did not witness the way in which he made 1984 into a year that would haunt a whole generation of Americans. Orwell died of tuberculosis in a London hospital in January 1950, just a few months after the book was published, at the age of 46. His awareness of imminent death may have added to the bitterness of the book. B. The science fiction of 1984. Many people think of 1984 as a science fiction novel, but almost the only item about 1984 that would lead one to suppose this is the fact that it is purportedly laid in the future. Not so. Orwell had no feel for the future, and the displacement of the story is much more geographical than temporal. The London in which the story is placed is not so much moved 35 years forward in time, from 1949 to 1984, as it is moved 1,000 miles east in space to Moscow. Orwell imagines Great Britain to have gone through a revolution similar to the Russian Revolution and to have gone through all the stages that Soviet development did. He can think of almost no variations on the theme. The Soviets had a series of purges in the 1930s, so the INGSOC, English Socialism, had a series of purges in the 1950s. The Soviets converted one of their revolutionaries, Leon Trotsky, into a villain, leaving his opponent, Joseph Stalin, as a hero. The INGSOC, therefore, convert one of their revolutionaries, Emmanuel Goldstein, into a villain, leaving his opponent, with a mustache like Stalin, as a hero. There is no ability to make minor changes, even. Goldstein, like Trotsky, has a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. Orwell apparently does not want to confuse the issue by giving Stalin a different name, so he calls him merely Big Brother. At the very beginning of the story, it is made clear that television, which was coming into existence at the time the book was written, served as a continuous means of indoctrination of the people, for sets cannot be turned off. And, apparently, In a deteriorating London in which nothing works, these sets never fail. The great Orwellian contribution to future technology is that the television set is two-way, and that the people who are forced to hear and see the television screen can themselves be heard and seen at all times and are under constant supervision even while sleeping or in the bathroom. Hence, the meaning of the phrase "Big Brother is watching you." This is an extraordinarily inefficient system of keeping everyone under control. To have a person being watched at all times means that some other person must be doing the watching at all times, at least in the Orwellian society, and must be doing so very narrowly, for there is a great development of the art of interpreting gesture and facial expression. One person cannot watch more than one person in full concentration, and can only do so for a comparatively short time before attention begins to wander. I should guess, in short, that there may have to be 5 watchers for every person watched. And then, of course, the watchers must themselves be watched since no one in the Orwellian world is suspicion-free. Consequently, the system of oppression by two-way television simply will not work. Orwell himself realized this by limiting its workings to the party members. The proletariat, for whom Orwell cannot hide his British upper-class contempt, are left largely to themselves as subhuman. At one point in the book, he says that any prole that shows ability is killed, a leaf taken out of the Spartan treatment of their helots 2,500 years ago. Furthermore, he has a system of volunteer spies in which children report on their parents, and neighbors on each other. This cannot possibly work well since eventually everyone reports everyone else and it all has to be abandoned. Orwell was unable to conceive of computers or robots, or he would have placed everyone under non-human surveillance. Our own computers to some extent do this in the IRS, in credit files, and so on, but that does not take us towards 1984, except in fevered imaginations. Computers and tyranny do not necessarily go hand in hand. Tyrannies have worked very well without computers. Consider the Nazis, and the most computerized nations in today's world are also the least tyrannical. Orwell lacks the capacity to see or invent small changes. His hero finds it difficult in his world of 1984 to get shoelaces or razor blades. So would I in the real world of the 1980s, for so many people use slip-on shoes and electric razors. Then, too, Orwell had the technophobic fixation that every technological advance is a slide downhill. Thus, when his hero writes, he fitted a nib into the penholder and sucked it to get the grease off. He does so because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Presumably, the ink pencil is the ballpoint pen that was coming into use at the time that 1984 was being written. This means that Orwell describes something as being written with a real nib but being scratched with a ballpoint. This is, however, precisely the reverse of the truth. If you are old enough to remember steel pens, you will remember that they scratched fearsomely, and you know ballpoints don't. This is not science fiction, but a distorted nostalgia for a past that never was. I am surprised that Orwell stopped with the steel pen and that he didn't have Winston writing with a neat goose quill. Nor was Orwell particularly prescient in the strictly social aspects of the future he was presenting, with the result that the Orwellian world of 1984 is incredibly old-fashioned when compared with the real world of the 1980s. Orwell imagines no new vices, for instance. His characters are all gin hounds and tobacco addicts, and part of the horror of his picture of 1984 is his eloquent description of the low quality of the gin and tobacco. He foresees no new drugs, no marijuana, no synthetic hallucinogens. No one expects an S.F. writer to be precise and exact in his forecasts, but surely one would expect him to invent some differences. In his despair or anger, Orwell forgets the virtues human beings have. All his characters are, in one way or another, weak or sadistic, or sleazy, or stupid, or repellent. This may be how most people are, or how Orwell wants to indicate they will all be under tyranny, but it seems to me that under even the worst tyrannies, so far, there have been brave men and women who have withstood the tyrants to the death and whose personal histories are luminous flames in the surrounding darkness. If only because there is no hint of this in 1984, it does not resemble the real world of the 1980s. Nor did he foresee any difference in the role of women or any weakening of the feminine stereotype of 1949. There are only 2 female characters of importance. One is a strong, brainless prole woman who is an endless washerwoman, endlessly singing a popular song with words of the type familiar in the 1930s and 1940s, at which Orwell shudders fastidiously as trashy, in blissful non-anticipation of hard rock. The other is the heroine, Julia, who is sexually promiscuous but is at least driven to courage by her interest in sex and is otherwise brainless. When the hero, Winston, reads to her the book within a book that explains the nature of the Orwellian world, she responds by falling asleep, but then since the treatise Winston reads is stupefyingly soporific, this may be an indication of Julia's good sense rather than the reverse. In short, if 1984 must be considered science fiction, then it is very bad science fiction. See The Government of 1984. Orwell's 1984 is a picture of all-powerful government, and it has helped make the notion of big government a very frightening one. We have to remember, though, that the world of the late 1940s, during which Orwell was writing his book, was one in which there had been, and still were, big governments with true tyrants, individuals whose every wish, however unjust, cruel or vicious, was law. What's more, it seemed as though such tyrants were irremovable except by the chance of outside force. Benito Mussolini of Italy, after 21 years of absolute rule, was overthrown, but that was only because his country was suffering defeat in war. Adolf Hitler of Germany, a far stronger and more brutal tyrant, ruled with a steel hand for 12 years, yet even defeat did not, in itself, bring about his overthrow. Though the area over which he ruled shrank and shrank and shrank, and even though overwhelming armies of his adversaries closed in from the east and west, he remained absolute tyrant over whatever area he controlled, even when it was only over the bunker in which he committed suicide. Until he removed himself, no one dared remove him. There were plots against him, to be sure, but they never worked, sometimes through quirks of fate that seemed explainable only by supposing that someone down there liked him. Orwell, however, had no time for either Mussolini or Hitler. His enemy was Stalin, and at the time that 1984 was published, Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union in a rib-breaking bear hug for 25 years, had survived a terrible war in which his nation suffered enormous losses, and yet was now stronger than ever. To Orwell, it must have seemed that neither time nor fortune could budge Stalin, but that he would live on forever with ever-increasing strength. And that was how Orwell pictured Big Brother. Of course, that was not the way it really was. Orwell didn't live long enough to see it, but Stalin died only 3 years after 1984 was published, and it was not long after that that his regime was denounced as a tyranny by guess who? The Soviet leadership. The Soviet Union is still the Soviet Union, but it is not Stalinist, and the enemies of the state are no longer liquidated. Orwell uses vaporized, instead, such small changes being all he can manage with quite such abandon. Again, Mao Zedong died in China, and while he himself has not been openly denounced, his close associates, as the Gang of Four, were promptly demoted from divinity, and while China is still China, it is not Maoist any longer. Franco of Spain died in his bed, and while, to his very last breath, he remained the unquestioned leader he had been for nearly 40 years, immediately after that last breath, fascism abruptly dwindled in Spain, as it had in Portugal after Salazar's death. In short, big brothers do die, or at least they have so far, and when they die, the government changes, always for the milder. This is not to say that new tyrants may not make themselves felt, but they will die, too. At least in the real 1980s we have every confidence they will, and the undying Big Brother is not yet a real threat. If anything, in fact, governments of the 1980s seem dangerously weak. The advance of technology has put powerful weapons, explosives, machine guns, fast cars into the hands of urban terrorists who can and do kidnap, hijack, gun down, and take hostages with impunity, while governments stand by more or less helplessly. In addition to the immortality of Big Brother, Orwell presents two other ways of maintaining an eternal tyranny. First, present someone or something to hate. In the Orwellian world it was Emmanuel Goldstein for whom hate was built up and orchestrated in a robotized mass function. This is nothing new, of course. Every nation in the world has used various neighbors for the purpose of hate. This sort of thing is so easily handled and comes as such second nature to humanity that one wonders why there have to be the organized hate drives in the Orwellian world. It needs scarcely any clever psychological mass movements to make Arabs hate Israelis and Greeks hate Turks and Catholic Irish hate Protestant Irish and vice versa in each case. To be sure, The Nazis organized mass meetings of delirium that every participant seemed to enjoy, but it had no permanent effect. Once the war moved onto German soil, the Germans surrendered as meekly as though they had never Sieg Heiled in their lives. Second, rewrite history. Almost every one of the few individuals we meet in 1984 has, as his job, the rapid rewriting of the past, the readjustment of statistics, the overhauling of newspapers as though anyone is going to take the trouble to pay attention to the past anyway. This Orwellian preoccupation with the minutiae of historical proof is typical of the political sectarian who is always quoting what has been said and done in the past to prove a point to someone on the other side who is always quoting something to the opposite effect that has been said and done. As any politician knows, no evidence of any kind is ever required. It is only necessary to make a statement, any statement, forcefully enough to have an audience believe it. No one will check the lie against the facts, and, if they do, they will disbelieve the facts. Do you think the German people in 1939 pretended that the Poles had attacked them and started World War II? No. Since they were told that was so, they believed it as seriously as you and I believe that they attacked the Poles. To be sure, the Soviets put out new editions of their encyclopedia in which politicians rating a long biography in earlier editions are suddenly omitted entirely, and this is no doubt the germ of the Orwellian notion, but the chances of carrying it as far as is described in 1984 seem to me to be nil, not because it is beyond human wickedness, but because it is totally unnecessary. Orwell makes much of newspeak, as an organ of repression, the conversion of the English language into so limited and abbreviated an instrument that the very vocabulary of dissent vanishes. Partly he got the notion from the undoubted habit of abbreviation. He gives examples of Communist International becoming Komintern, and Geheime Staatspolizei becoming Gestapo, but that is not a modern totalitarian invention. Vulgus Mobile became Mob, Taxi Cabriolet became Cab, Quasi-stellar radio source became Quasar, light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation became laser, and so on. There is no sign that such compressions of the language have ever weakened it as a mode of expression. As a matter of fact, political obfuscation has tended to use many words rather than few, long words rather than short, to extend rather than to reduce. Every leader of inadequate education or limited intelligence hides behind exuberant inebriation of loquacity. Thus, when Winston Churchill suggested the development of Basic English as an international language, something which undoubtedly also contributed to newspeak, the suggestion was stillborn. We are therefore in no way approaching newspeak in its condensed form, though we have always had newspeak in its extended form and always will have. We also have a group of young people among us who say things like, "Right on, man, you know. It's like he's got it all together, you know, man. I mean, like you know," and so on for 5 minutes when the word that the young people are groping for is huh. That, however, is not newspeak, and it has always been with us, too. It is something which in old speak is called inarticulacy, and it is not what Orwell had in mind. The international situation of 1984. Although Orwell seemed, by and large, to be helplessly stuck in the world of 1949, in one respect at least he showed himself to be remarkably prescient, and that was in foreseeing the tripartite split of the world of the 1980s. The international world of 1984 is a world of three superpowers: Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia, and that fits in, very roughly, with the three actual superpowers of the 1980s, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Oceania is a combination of the United States and the British Empire. Orwell, who was an old imperial civil servant, did not seem to notice that the British Empire was in its last throes in the late 1940s and was about to dissolve. He seems to suppose, in fact, that the British Empire is the dominant member of the British-American combination. At least, the entire action takes place in London, and phrases such as the United States and Americans are rarely, if ever, mentioned. But then, this is very much in the fashion of the British spy novel in which, ever since World War II, Great Britain, currently about the 18th strongest military and economic power in the world, is set up as the great adversary of the Soviet Union, or of China, or of some invented international conspiracy, with the United States either never mentioned or reduced to the small courtesy appearance of an occasional CIA agent. Eurasia is, of course, the Soviet Union, which Orwell assumes will have absorbed the whole European continent. Eurasia, therefore, includes all of Europe, plus Siberia, and its population is 95% European by any standard. Nevertheless, Orwell describes the Eurasians as solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces. Since Orwell still lives in a time when European and Asiatic are equivalent to hero and villain, it is impossible to inveigh against the Soviet Union with the proper emotion if it is not thought of as Asiatic. This comes under the heading of what Orwellian newspeak calls doublethink, something that Orwell, like any human being, is good at. It may be, of course, that Orwell is thinking not of Eurasia, or the Soviet Union, but of his great Betnor, Stalin. Stalin is a Georgian, and Georgia, lying south of the Caucasus Mountains, is, by strict geographic considerations, part of Asia. Eastasia is, of course, China and various dependent nations. Here is prescience. At the time Orwell was writing 1984, the Chinese communists had not yet won control of the country, and many, in the United States, in particular, were doing their best to see that the anti-communist, Chiang Kai-shek, retained control. Once the communists won, it became part of the accepted credo of the West that the Chinese would be under thorough Soviet control and that China and the Soviet Union would form a monolithic communist power. Orwell not only foresaw the communist victory, he saw that victory everywhere, in fact, but also foresaw that Russia and China would not form a monolithic bloc but would be deadly enemies. There, his own experience as a leftist sectarian may have helped him. He had no rightist superstitions concerning leftists as unified and indistinguishable villains. He knew they would fight each other as fiercely over the most trifling points of doctrine as would the most pious of Christians. He also foresaw a permanent state of war among the three, a condition of permanent stalemate with the alliances ever shifting, but always two against the strongest. This was the old-fashioned balance of power, system which was used in ancient Greece, in medieval Italy, and in early modern Europe. Orwell's mistake lay in thinking there had to be actual war to keep the merry-go-round of the balance of power in being. In fact, in one of the more laughable parts of the book, he goes on and on concerning the necessity of permanent war as a means of consuming the world's production of resources and thus keeping the social stratification of upper, middle, and lower classes in being. This sounds like a very leftist explanation of war as the result of a conspiracy worked out with great difficulty. In actual fact, the decades since 1945 have been remarkably war-free as compared with the decades before it. There have been local wars in profusion, but no general war. But then, war is not required as a desperate device to consume the world's resources. That can be done by such other devices as endless increase in population and in energy use, neither of which Orwell considers. Orwell did not foresee any of the significant economic changes that have taken place since World War II. He did not foresee the role of oil or its declining availability or its increasing price, or the escalating power of those nations who control it. I don't recall his mentioning the word oil. But perhaps it is close enough to mark Orwellian prescience here, if we substitute Cold War for war. There has been, in fact, a more or less continual Cold War, that has served to keep employment high and solve some short-term economic problems at the cost of creating long-term greater ones. And this Cold War is enough to deplete resources. Furthermore, the alliances shifted as Orwell foresaw and very nearly as suddenly. When the United States seemed all-powerful, the Soviet Union and China were both vociferously anti-American and in a kind of alliance. As American power decreased, the Soviet Union and China fell apart and, for a while, each of the three powers inveighed against the other two equally. Then, when the Soviet Union came to seem particularly powerful, a kind of alliance sprang up between the United States and China, as they cooperated in vilifying the Soviet Union, and spoke softly of each other. In 1984 every shift of alliance involved an orgy of history rewriting. In real life, no such folly is necessary. The public swings from side to side easily, accepting the change in circumstance with no concern for the past at all. For instance, the Japanese, by the 1950s, had changed from unspeakable villains to friends, while the Chinese moved in the opposite direction with no one bothering to wipe out Pearl Harbor. No one cared, for goodness sake. Orwell has his three great powers voluntarily forego the use of nuclear bombs, and to be sure such bombs have not been used in war since 1945. That, however, may be because the only powers with large nuclear arsenals, the United States and the Soviet Union, have avoided war with each other. Were there actual war, it is extremely doubtful that one side or the other would not finally feel it necessary to push the button. In that respect, Orwell perhaps falls short of reality. London does, however, occasionally suffer a missile strike, which sounds very much like a V-1 or V-2 weapon of 1944, and the city is in a 1945-type shambles. Orwell cannot make 1984 very different from 1944 in this respect. Orwell, in fact, makes it clear that by 1984, the universal communism of the three superpowers has choked science and reduced it to uselessness except in those areas where it is needed for war. There is no question but that the nations are more eager to invest in science where war applications are in clear view, but, alas, there is no way of separating war from peace where applications are in question. Science is a unit, and everything in it could conceivably be related to war and destruction. Science has therefore not been choked off but continues not only in the United States and Western Europe and Japan, but also in the Soviet Union and in China. The advances of science are too numerous to attempt to list, but think of lasers and computers as war weapons with infinite peaceful applications. To summarize, then, George Orwell in 1984 was, in my opinion, engaging in a private feud with Stalinism, rather than attempting to forecast the future. He did not have the science-fictional knack of foreseeing a plausible future and, in actual fact, in almost all cases, the world of 1984 bears no relation to the real world of the 1980s. The world may go communist, if not by 1984, then by some not very much later date, or it may see civilization destroyed. If this happens, however, it will happen in a fashion quite different from that depicted in 1984, and if we try to prevent either eventuality by imagining that 1984 is accurate, then we will be defending ourselves against assaults from the wrong direction and we will lose.